The spring of 1942 belonged entirely to Japan. In just 5 months, the Imperial Navy and Army had seized an empire that stretched from the Burmese border to the Gilbert Islands, from the Aleutians almost to Australia. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, had fallen in 70 days. The American bastion of the Philippines had collapsed in 5 months. The Dutch East Indies, with their priceless oil, were already feeding Japan's war machine. Pearl Harbor still burned in the American mind as proof that the Pacific Fleet had been gutted. The recent Battle of the Coral Sea, fought only days earlier, was being celebrated in Tokyo as another triumph because the Americans lost the carrier Lexington, while Japan lost only the light carrier Shoho. That Japan's invasion of Port Moresby had been turned back was mentioned in no official communique. Victory disease, though the phrase had not yet been coined, was already coursing through the arteries of the Imperial Navy. Deep inside the armored citadel of the super-battleship Yamato, anchored in the sheltered waters of Hashirajima near Hiroshima, the architects of the next conquest gathered to look into a mirror they believed would only reflect glory. Yamato was more than a warship. At 72,000 tons, she was the largest battleship ever built, a floating shrine to national destiny, and her very existence was meant to make lesser navies feel small. Below her main deck, sealed behind bulkheads thick enough to shrug off 16-inch shells, lay a long compartment that had been cleared for one purpose: to play the future before it arrived. At the center of the room stood a table 40 feet long and 15 feet wide. Across its surface, the entire Central Pacific had been recreated with obsessive precision. Islands were molded in green felt, ocean depths shaded from pale turquoise to midnight blue. Tiny wooden blocks, each no longer than a man's thumb, represented carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Aircraft squadrons were marked by colored map pins, red for Japan, blue for the United States. A grid of white chalk lines divided the sea into measurable squares. Movement was calculated by the hour, fuel consumption tracked to the gallon, aircraft ranges plotted to the mile. At one end of the table sat small lacquered boxes containing ivory dice, the impartial arbiters of combat. This was not a game in the childish sense. It was the Imperial Japanese Navy's most sophisticated attempt to let mathematics and probability speak the truth about war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto presided from the head of the table. He looked older than his 58 years, the skin around his eyes etched by too many nights spent calculating odds that no one else wanted to face. He had staked everything on Operation MI, the seizure of Midway Atoll and the destruction of the remaining American carriers. He had threatened to resign twice when his colleagues argued for safer, smaller operations. He believed Japan had perhaps 6 months, no more, before American industry made victory impossible. Midway was the trap. The American fleet would come out to defend the atoll, and there it would die. Around the table stood the elite of the combined fleet staff. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff and closest confidant, would serve as chief umpire. His diary already recorded quiet doubts, but his loyalty to Yamamoto and to the service was absolute. Representatives of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who would actually lead the carrier strike force, watched with folded arms and expressionless faces. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, stood slightly apart, fingers drumming almost imperceptibly against his thigh. A dozen other officers, captains, commanders, specialists in gunnery, aviation, and logistics, completed the circle. The war game began at 4:30 on the simulated morning of 4th June 1942. Japanese reconnaissance planes spread across the table in careful arcs. At 0600, the first strike, 108 aircraft from the 4 fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was launched against Midway's airfield. Tiny red pins arced southward across the felt ocean. The dice rolled with the dry, decisive clatter of bones. Midway's fighters were swept aside. Its runways were cratered. Its anti-aircraft fire proved ineffective. The first wave returned safely. So far, everything followed the meticulous plan drafted over months of staff work. Then the officer assigned to play the American side made his first unexpected move. He was never identified by name in the official records, only as the opposing force planner, a lieutenant commander whose normal duties involve logistics, not high strategy. Everyone in the room assumed the Americans would behave as they always had. Cautiously, reactively, defensively. They would wait for the Japanese to reveal their hand, then respond with whatever forces remained after Coral Sea. The Japanese staff had built that assumption into every contingency. The junior officer did not wait. At 0700 simulated time, while Japanese flight decks were busy recovering the Midway strike and preparing a second wave, he announced that 2 American carriers, later identified as Enterprise and Hornet, had sortied from Pearl Harbor far earlier and far more aggressively than anyone believed possible. They were already northeast of Midway, hidden by weather, and they were launching a full deckload strike. 78 dive bombers and torpedo planes were now streaking toward the Japanese fleet at 180 knots. The room grew quieter than any battle station. Dice clattered across the table like spent cartridge cases. The umpires, senior captains trained to interpret probability tables compiled from years of fleet exercises, consulted their charts in silence. 9 direct bomb hits on Akagi, 7 on Kaga, multiple torpedo strikes registered against both flight decks. According to the official damage tables, both carriers were mortally wounded and sinking. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of Yamato's ventilation and the soft creak of the ship moving at anchor. Rear Admiral Ugaki leaned forward. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost conversational. That result is operationally unreasonable. American carriers cannot possibly have reached that launch position undetected by our search pattern. Furthermore, the concentration of hits exceeds historical precedent. Re-roll the attack. The dice were gathered and rolled again. The second result was almost identical. 8 hits on Akagi, 6 on Kaga, both ships ruled lost with all hands. Ugaki did not raise his voice. Even granting the Americans an improbable launch position, our combat air patrol would have intercepted the majority of the strike. Reduce effective hits by 50%. Akagi is heavily damaged but retains flight capability. Kaga suffers controllable flooding and will remain in formation. No one protested. To protest would be to challenge the Chief of Staff of Combined Fleet in the presence of Yamamoto himself. Yamamoto sat motionless, eyes half closed, as though listening to a distant radio broadcast only he could hear. The lieutenant commander who had just sunk 2 Japanese fleet carriers opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again. Hierarchy in the Imperial Navy was not a system, it was physics. A lieutenant commander did not correct a rear admiral any more than a private corrected a general. Minoru Genda watched the exchange with a tightness around his mouth that might have been anger or simple recognition of the inevitable. Later in the same turn, the American player launched a follow-up strike of torpedo planes flying low and fast beneath radar coverage. Once again, the dice punished Japan. Soryu took 3 hits below the waterline and began settling by the bow. Ugaki's pen moved across the logbook with quiet finality. American torpedo performance is known to be defective. Have the hits. Soryu is damaged but operational. By the end of the first day of play, the wargame had predicted absolute catastrophe for the Japanese carrier force on 3 separate occasions. Each time the catastrophe was edited, reduced, or erased entirely. The wooden blocks representing Akagi and Kaga were returned to the table as if they had never been removed. The pins representing American aircraft were moved back to positions the staff considered more plausible. During a brief recess, Genda found the lieutenant commander standing alone near a porthole, staring out at the calm anchorage as though it were already on fire. "You saw what actually happens if we follow the plan as written," Genda said quietly. The younger man nodded once, a motion so small it might have been a tremor. Neither of them spoke again. There was nothing left to say that would be heard. Far above their heads, the real sun climbed toward noon, indifferent to the drama being rewritten in the armored depths. Inside the war room, the ivory dice cooled in their boxes, waiting for the next roll. The war game had spoken, but Japan refused to listen. The second day of the war game began with the scent of fresh chalk and the soft rustle of rewritten reality. Overnight, the staff had adjusted the initial deployment charts. American carriers were now placed farther east, exactly where Japanese intelligence insisted they must still be repairing damage from Coral Sea. Search patterns were reinforced. Combat air patrols were thickened. The dice, it was quietly agreed, would be encouraged to behave themselves. At 0900 simulated time on the 4th of June, the Japanese launched their second strike against Midway. 108 aircraft again, level bombers, dive bombers, fighters. The pins arced south across the table with ceremonial grace. The dice rolled cleanly, runways destroyed, fuel tanks ablaze, Midway neutralized. Applause was not permitted in Yamato's war room, but satisfaction settled over the table like incense. Then the opposing force player moved again. He had spent the night studying the revised search patterns. He noticed the same gap that had existed the day before, a 120-degree arc to the north-northeast, where only one floatplane from cruiser Tone was scheduled to fly, and even that launch had been delayed in the plan by 30 minutes to simulate mechanical trouble. It was the kind of detail a logistics officer would notice. At 0920, he declared that the American task forces had closed to within 180 miles during the night, using cloud cover and radical course changes. Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, whose very existence in the order of battle had been dismissed as American propaganda, were now launching a coordinated full-deck strike. 70 dive bombers, 20 torpedo planes, escorted by 30 fighters. The dice hit the felt with a sound like hail on steel. 13 hits registered on Akagi, 11 on Kaga, 8 on Soryu. Fires reported raging through hangars. Magazines threatened. The silence that followed was colder than before. Mitome Ugaki did not look up from his log immediately. When he did, his eyes were flat. "Reflight the attack," he ordered. "Assume the Tone floatplane departs on schedule and provides 30 minutes warning. Our fighters intercept." The umpires obeyed. Pins representing 0 fighters rose to meet the Americans halfway. New dice were rolled for interceptions. 6 American aircraft were ruled shot down. Hits against the carriers were reduced to 4, then 2, then none at all. Akagi suffered minor topside damage. Kaga's flight deck was scarred but usable. Soryu emerged untouched. The lieutenant commander playing the American side stared at the table as though it had begun speaking a foreign language. He started to object, quietly, respectfully, that historical interception rates against coordinated strikes escorted by fighters rarely exceeded 20%. Ugaki's gaze flicked toward him for half a second, and the objection died unborn. Minoru Genda felt the words rise in his own throat and swallowed them. He had flown in China, at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean. He knew what happened when 40 or 50 dive bombers arrived high and unopposed while fighters were busy chasing torpedo planes down on the water. He also knew the temperature of the room when Ugaki's patience cooled. Later that afternoon, the American player tried a different approach. He sent in low-level torpedo attacks first, sacrificing the slow devastators to pull the Zero patrol down to sea level. Then brought the dauntless dive bombers over the top exactly as doctrine taught. The dice, indifferent to rank, obliged with a massacre. Here you took 4 torpedoes and capsized in 12 minutes. Akagi's rudder jammed. She circled helplessly under renewed bombing. Ugaki ruled that American torpedoes rarely worked. Hits reduced by 75%. Here you damaged, but fighting. Akagi under tow. By now the pattern was unmistakable. Every time the mathematics predicted disaster, the umpires reached for one of 3 remedies: earlier detection, higher interception rates, or defective American ordnance. Each remedy was defensible in isolation. Together they formed a wall behind which the Japanese fleet could not be harmed. During the evening break, Genda cornered one of the umpires, a gunnery specialist he had known since Etajima. They stood beneath a ventilator that smelled of machine oil and distant cherry blossoms carried on the spring wind. "Tell me honestly," Genda said in a voice barely louder than the fan. "If the Americans do to us what we just did to ourselves 3 times today, what happens?" The captain glanced over his shoulder. "Then we lose the war in an afternoon." "And if we report that?" The captain's smile was thin and bloodless. "Then we insult the ancestors who gave us 6 straight victories. You know how this works, Minoru. The plan is sacred. The staff has spoken. To question further is to question Yamamoto himself." Genda let the silence answer for him. That night, in the privacy of his cabin, Mitome Ugaki wrote in his diary, The war game proceeds favorably after certain unreasonable results were adjusted. The enemy continues to behave with improbable boldness, but our countermeasures prove adequate in every case. Some younger officers appear unduly pessimistic. He closed the diary, turned off the light, and slept the sleep of a man who believed he had saved the future by correcting it. Aboard Yamato, the dice were cleaned, the charts redrawn, the sunken carriers resurrected one final time. The American player was quietly removed from the opposing force desk and replaced by a more senior captain who understood that the purpose of the exercise was to confirm, not to discover. On the morning of the third day, the war game reached its scripted climax. Japanese invasion forces landed unopposed on Midway. American carriers, battered by repeated strikes from an undamaged Kido butai, retreated eastward. The rising sun flew over a new outpost 1,200 miles closer to Hawaii. Yamato allowed himself the smallest tightening of the lips that might, to a generous observer, have been a smile. "The operation is feasible," he declared. "Proceed with planning." No one mentioned that the only reason the operation had become feasible was that reality had been forbidden to behave like reality. Far away in Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort sat hunched over purple decrypts in the dungeon beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters. Sweat stained his shirt dark. He had not seen daylight in days. The messages were fragments, call signs, grid coordinates, dates, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Japanese were coming to Midway, and they believed the American carriers would either stay in port or arrive exactly when expected. Rochefort lit another cigarette with shaking fingers. He knew Yorktown was already patching battle damage at a speed that defied engineering logic. He knew Spruance and Fletcher were preparing to do precisely what the Yamato wargamers had ruled impossible. But that was another ocean, another story. Aboard Yamato, the great table was cleared. Wooden ships returned to their boxes, chalk erased, dice locked away. The staff filed out into corridors that smelled of oiled steel and certainty. Behind them, the war game sat in the dark, silent, wounded, but not dead. It had tried to scream with every roll of the ivory bones. It had shown the same catastrophe again and again. Japanese carriers caught rearming, combat air patrol out of position, American dive bombers falling unmolested out of the sun. Each time the scream had been muffled by polite hands. The simulations screamed danger, and the umpires turned the volume down. While Yamato's war room erased disasters with the quiet efficiency of men sweeping snow from a temple path, the real Pacific refused to be edited. In the damp concrete basement of Pearl Harbor's administration building, known simply as the Dungeon, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers worked beneath a ceiling so low that tall men walked stooped like penitents. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the sour smell of unwashed uniforms, and the endless clatter of typewriter keys. Stacks of intercepted Japanese radio messages rose in untidy piles. Most were encrypted in JN-25, the Imperial Navy's main operational code, and most still looked like gibberish to anyone except the 30-odd misfits Rochefort had collected. Musicians, engineers, a champion chess player, and a Choctaw linguist who could hear rhythm where others heard only noise. By the third week of May, they had heard enough. The target was AF, and AF was Midway. The date was early June. The force was overwhelming. 4 large carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, including Yamato herself. Most importantly, the messages kept repeating that only 2 American carriers were expected to be operational. Yorktown had been reported critically damaged at Coral Sea. The Japanese believed she would need months in dry dock. They were wrong. 1,000 miles south of Oahu, at Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard, welders and shipfitters worked around the clock under floodlights that turned night into a harsh white day. Yorktown limped home on 27th of May with a hole in her side big enough to drive a truck through, her innards twisted by a Japanese bomb. Normal repair estimates gave her 90 days. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave the yard superintendent 3. Workers swarmed over her like ants on a wounded beast. Entire sections of steel plate were prefabricated on the dock and hoisted aboard by cranes that never stopped swinging. Flight deck planking was laid, while welders still cut away ruptured bulkheads below. Men slept in shifts of 4 hours, ate sandwiches on the flight deck, and kept working. By the evening of 29th of May, 72 hours after arrival, Yorktown's engines turned, her patched boilers built up steam, and her lifts carried the first fresh aircraft to a deck that still smelled of new paint and scorched steel. On the morning of 30th May, she sailed, listing slightly from unrepaired flooding, but very much alive. Her air group was a patchwork: orphan squadrons from Saratoga, new pilots straight from training commands, torpedoes that everyone knew were defective. None of that mattered. She was sailing, and the Japanese did not know. 2 days later, on the 1st June, Task Force 16 sortied under Raymond Spruance, Enterprise and Hornet screened by 6 cruisers and a ring of destroyers. The following day, Task Force 17 followed with Yorktown under Frank Jack Fletcher. Their orders were simple and chilling. Proceed to a point 350 miles northeast of Midway, codenamed Point Luck, remain undetected, and wait. When the Japanese carriers revealed themselves by launching against the atoll, the Americans would strike first and without warning. Everything the Yamato war game had declared impossible was now underway. Back in the inland sea, the Japanese fleet assembled with ceremonial precision. Nagumo's first carrier, striking force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, steamed in 2 parallel columns, their decks crowded with aircraft painted with the blood-red Hinamaru. Below, crews polished torpedoes and stacked bombs the way farmers stack rice. No one spoke openly of the war game anymore, but the memory lingered like a bruise. Minoru Genda flew his flag in Akagi as air officer. He had tried once more, in private, to persuade Nagumo to keep half the fighters back as permanent combat air patrol, and to launch a full-scale search the moment the fleet cleared the overcast belt. Nagumo listened politely, then repeated the official doctrine: the enemy would be found by our search planes. When he was found, we would destroy him with overwhelming force. Doctrine had worked at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean. Doctrine would work again. On the 3rd of June, the invasion force separated. Transports carrying 2,000 troops turned south toward Midway under heavy escort. Nagumo's carriers, screened by battleships Haruna and Kirishima, increased speed to 24 knots and steered east-southeast into a region of low pressure and broken cloud. The weather was perfect for remaining unseen and terrible for seeing anyone else. Aboard Tone and Chikuma, the heavy cruisers tasked with launching the long-range search, the float planes were readied. One aircraft from Tone's No. 4 catapult developed engine trouble the night 3rd of June. Maintenance crews worked through the night. The plane would be ready by dawn, they promised. No one considered that a 30-minute delay in one search sector might matter. In Pearl Harbor, Rochefort finally allowed himself 8 hours of sleep. When he woke, the latest decrypts confirmed that the Japanese carrier force had passed the edge of American submarine pickets undetected. The trap was closing from both sides, and only one side knew it. On Midway itself, Marines and Army Air Forces crews worked by lantern light to disperse aircraft and dig revetments. Extra fuel drums were rolled into the surf and sunk to deny them to the enemy. Every man on the atoll knew the Japanese were coming. Almost no one believed the island could be held. Their job was to hurt the enemy badly enough that the carriers hiding at Point Luck could finish the work. The night of 3rd of June was moonless and restless. Aboard Enterprise, Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge in a khaki windbreaker, staring into blackness. He had never fought a battle at sea, had never commanded carriers, had never even wanted the job. Nimitz had given it to him because Halsey was in hospital and because Spruance was cold-blooded and smart. Somewhere out there, 4 Japanese carriers were closing the noose, confident they were the hunters. Spruance rehearsed the plan in his head one more time. Wait until the enemy launched against Midway. Wait until their decks were spotted for the second strike. Then hit them with everything before they could recover aircraft or rearm. Simple on paper. Impossible if you were detected first. At 0200 on the 4th of June, the American task forces reached Point Luck and turned into the wind. Flight decks were cleared for immediate launch if scouts found the enemy early. Radar screens glowed green and empty. The waiting began. In the Japanese fleet, Shuichi Nagumo slept poorly. He woke long before dawn and climbed to Akagi's bridge. The air smelled of salt and aviation gasoline. Around him, the fleet moved in perfect formation. Running lights extinguished, only the faint phosphorescence of wakes betraying their passage. He felt the old confidence returning. The Americans were cautious. They would react slowly. By the time they arrived, Midway would be Japanese, and the trap sprung in the wrong direction. At 4:30, the first search planes were catapulted into the dark. 7 aircraft spread out in a fan that reached 300 miles. One of them, the delayed plane from Tone, finally roared off the cruiser's catapult at 0500 instead of 0430. Its pilot turned north-northeast along the assigned track, climbing into the overcast. By 600, the first strike wave was already forming up. 36 Kate-level bombers, 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Zero fighters. Deck crews moved with practiced calm. Below, in the hangars, armorers were already preparing the reserve aircraft with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for the second wave that would surely be needed against the American fleet once it was located. No one noticed that the combat air patrol overhead consisted of only 12 Zeros. No one noticed that the reserve strike was being spotted with weapons meant for ships, not land targets. No one, in short, was prepared for what was about to happen. Everything Japan had dismissed as unrealistic on a 40-foot table in Yamato's armored belly. The early American launch, the undetected approach, the coordinated strike arriving exactly when the carriers were most vulnerable. America was preparing at that very moment in the real world. 4 June 1942, new 4:30 local time. The sky over the central Pacific was the color of tarnished pewter, low clouds scudding beneath a high overcast. Aboard Nagumo's 4 carriers, the flight decks vibrated with the roar of warming engines. Signal flags snapped up the halyards. Prepare to launch. At 4:45, the first Kate reared off Akagi's deck, followed in perfect 30-second intervals by the rest of the 108-plane strike. They circled once, formed up, and turned south toward Midway, 240 miles away. The second wave, another 108 aircraft, was already being towed up from the hangars. Armorers wheeled trolleys loaded with 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs and Mark 13 aerial torpedoes. The plan was clear. The moment the American fleet was sighted, the reserve aircraft would be rearmed for ship killing and launched immediately. At 6, the strike wave reported Midway sighted. Minutes later, the island erupted under bombs and strafing. Runways cratered, hangars burned. Midway radioed frantically that it was under heavy attack. Nagumo allowed himself a thin smile. So far, everything was exactly on schedule. Then the first thread unraveled. At 7:05, a frantic message crackled from the delayed search plane of cruiser. Tone, enemy carrier force sighted, bearing 010, distance 180 miles, course south. The pilot had flown 30 minutes late and had turned slightly off track to compensate. He had stumbled across Task Force 16 by sheer accident. Nagumo's staff stared at the message as though it were written in blood. The American carriers were already within striking range, and the Japanese reserve aircraft were still armed with high-explosive bombs for land targets. To rearm for anti-ship strike would take at least 90 minutes. To launch as they were would mean attacking carriers with weapons designed for concrete runways. Nagumo hesitated for 8 critical minutes, then issued the order every aviator in the fleet had dreaded. Recover the Midway strike, rearm the reserve aircraft with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The order went out at 07:15. Below decks, chaos erupted in the name of discipline. Bombs were struck back down into magazines. Torpedoes were manhandled across crowded hangars. Fuel hoses snaked everywhere. Deck edges were lined with ordnance waiting to be changed. In Akagi's hangar, an 800 kilograms bomb rolled off a trolley and came to rest against a stack of torpedoes. No one had time to move it. Overhead, the combat air patrol had been reduced to a handful of Zeros chasing American torpedo planes that began arriving at 7:55 TBD. Devastators from Hornet, flying so low their propellers almost touched the wave crests. The Zeros slaughtered them. Only 6 of 15 survived to drop their torpedoes. Every torpedo either ran deep or failed to detonate. But the Zeros were now down on the water, fuel running low, pilots focused on the slow Americans. At 10:20, the radar operator aboard Akagi reported a new wave approaching from the south. Nagumo dismissed it. More torpedo planes, probably. The Zeros would handle them. They were not torpedo planes. High above the cloud layer, 37 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown, led by Clarence Wade McCluskey and Maxwell Leslie, had spent an hour searching in the wrong sector. Fuel was critical. McCluskey was about to turn for home when he spotted the white wake of a lone Japanese destroyer hurrying north. He followed it like a compass needle. At 10:22, he broke through the clouds and looked down on the most perfect target any naval aviator would ever see. 4 Japanese carriers sailed in a loose box formation, turning lazily into the wind. Their decks were spotted with aircraft. Fuel hoses and bombs lay everywhere. Zeros flew far below, chasing ghosts. McCluskey rolled into his dive on Kaga. Behind him, the sky filled with screaming dauntlesses. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:24. It penetrated the flight deck near the bridge and exploded in the hangar. Secondary explosions followed instantly as aviation fuel ignited. Within seconds, Kaga was a torch. 30 seconds later, 3 bombs hit Akagi in rapid succession. One detonated amid the parked aircraft amidships. The blast set off torpedoes and bombs stacked along the deck edge. Genda, standing on Akagi's bridge, saw the flight deck lift like a carpet being shaken. Nagumo was led away, stunned, refusing to leave until every man possible was ordered off. Flames raced through the ship faster than fire parties could respond. At almost the same moment, Soryu took 4 direct hits. Her fate was sealed in 90 seconds. Men on nearby destroyers watched her hangar deck erupt in a single orange sheet. 5 minutes. From 10:22 to 10:27. 3 fleet carriers mortally wounded, their crews already leaping into a sea that was beginning to burn. Hiryu, steaming 10 miles north with Yamamoto's battleship screen, remained untouched. Her scouts found Yorktown at 11. Her strike, 18 vowels and 6 zeros, launched immediately and scored 3 bomb hits that forced Yorktown to a halt. But the Japanese had shot their bolt. American fighters from Enterprise and the wounded Yorktown tore the second strike apart on its way home. By 14, Hiryu herself was found by 24 dauntlesses from Enterprise. 4 bombs turned her into the 4th pyre of the morning. Far to the west aboard Yamato, the news arrived in fragments. Air attack, heavy damage, fires out of control. Yamamoto stood motionless as each successive report confirmed what the war game had tried to tell him weeks earlier. At 1900 on the 4th of June, he ordered general retreat. The greatest naval striking force Japan ever assembled was reduced to 1 damaged light carrier and a handful of escorts limping northwest. In the space of 1 morning, the Imperial Navy lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. More than 300 aircraft were gone. Worst of all, the cream of Japan's naval air arm, 322 experienced pilots and aircrew, were dead or drowning. They could not be replaced. The prophecy Japan buried had been fulfilled, in fire. The sun set red on the 4th of June 1942. The color of arterial blood spilled across the Pacific sky. 4 Japanese fleet carriers burned through the night, their steel skeletons glowing like temple braziers. Akagi finally went under at 5:20 on the 5th, her bow rising slowly until the great red Hinamaru on her flight deck pointed at the sky like an accusation. Kaga followed at dawn, rolling over with a sigh that carried for miles. Soryu and Hiryu sank later that day, taking with them over 3,000 officers and men, many of whom had been at their battle stations for 36 hours straight, fighting fires that no human effort could quench. Aboard the destroyer Nowaki, survivors clung to nets and rafts while the sea around them shimmered with burning oil. One young ensign from Akagi was heard repeating the same sentence over and over as he was hauled aboard. The dice were right. The dice were right. Back in Japan, the news was kept secret for weeks. Newspapers spoke of a great victory at Midway. Casualty lists were withheld. The Naval General Staff circulated an internal report that blamed the disaster on bad luck, poor visibility, and an unexpected concentration of enemy air power. The war game aboard Yamato was never mentioned. Matomi Ugaki's diary entry for 8th of June, written after he finally learned the full extent of the loss, is brief and terrible in its restraint. The results of the fleet exercise in May were closer to reality than we wish to believe. I bear heavy responsibility. Yamamoto himself said nothing in public. In private, he told his staff, "We have lost the war. The rest is merely a question of how long we can delay the inevitable." He was relieved of operational command of the combined fleet in August and sent to inspect distant garrisons, a polite form of exile. On the 18th of April 1943, an American P-38 would find his transport over Bougainville and shoot it down, ending the life of the one man who had understood the arithmetic of the Pacific War from the beginning. Nagumo survived the battle physically, but not professionally. He was transferred to shore duties and eventually given command of the defense of Saipan, where he would take his own life with a pistol in July 1944, rather than face capture. Minoru Genda lived to see the end of the war, carrying the memory of those 5 minutes in June like a stone in his chest. In later years, he would say quietly to American interviewers, "We practiced the battle many times on a table. We simply refused to accept the result when it happened for real." The strategic consequences unfolded with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Japan's 6-month streak of unbroken victories ended in a single morning. The elite corps of naval aviators, men who had flown since China in 1937, who had perfected the art of carrier warfare when the rest of the world was still learning, could never be replaced. New pilots sent to Rabaul and the Solomons in 1943 and 1944 would have as little as 3 months training and 30 hours in type. They died in job lots against Americans who now possessed not only overwhelming material superiority, but the hard-won knowledge of how to use it. Midway did not merely halt Japanese expansion, it reversed the psychological polarity of the Pacific War. From that day forward, Japan fought a defensive war of attrition she could not win. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the Philippine Sea, Lake Gulf. Each battle was a station of the cross leading to August 1945. Yet the deepest wound was invisible. The Imperial Navy never again trusted its own war games. Exercises after 1942 became ceremonial, designed to confirm doctrine rather than test it. Reports that contained bad news were softened, delayed, or suppressed. The culture that had rewritten dice rolls aboard Yamato in May metastasized into a habit of national self-deception. Pilots were ordered into attacks they could not survive. Ships sailed without adequate air cover. Intelligence that contradicted preconceptions was ignored. The same rigidity that silenced a lieutenant commander in a war room eventually silenced an entire empire. In the end, the cover-up failed as completely as the battle. American codebreakers read the damage assessments almost as quickly as Tokyo. Nimitz knew exactly what he had achieved before Yorktown herself was lost to a submarine 3 days later. The victory was kept quiet for domestic reasons. The American public was told only that a great battle had been won. But inside the Navy, it was understood immediately. The Japanese carrier force had been decapitated, and the war had turned on the fulcrum of 5 minutes no one in Tokyo had been willing to imagine. Today, the wrecks lie where they sank. Akagi rests upright in 18,000 feet of water, her imperial chrysanthemum still visible on the bow. Kaga lies nearby, split open like a flower. Soryu and Hiryu are scattered across the abyssal plain, silent witnesses beneath currents that have never known daylight. Occasionally, a research submarine visits them. The images that return are strangely peaceful. Garden eels waving from flight decks, coral beginning to colonize steel that once shook the world. And in those images lies the final, bitter lesson. Every organization, military, corporate, political, eventually faces its own version of the Yamato war room. A simulation, a forecast, a risk assessment, a lonely analyst who runs the numbers and sees disaster coming. The temptation is always the same. Adjust the assumptions, massage the data, promote the optimistic scenario, silence the bearer of bad news. It feels like leadership, it feels like loyalty, it feels like protecting morale. It is none of those things. It is suicide by pride. Japan did not lose the Battle of Midway on 4th of June 1942. Japan lost it weeks earlier, in the armored belly of a battleship that never fired a shot in anger, when senior admirals looked truth in the face and ordered it rewritten. The dice had spoken clearly, the mathematics were merciless, human ego simply refused to listen. The future does not negotiate with hierarchy, probability does not bow to rank. Warnings ignored do not expire, they wait in the dark, patient as depth charges, until the exact moment they are needed. Then they detonate. Japan cheated the war game, but truth cannot be cheated. If you believe forgotten truths deserve to be told, subscribe for more untold World War II revelations.